Hey, good morning, everyone. It's Sunday, July 7th. I'm Mark Dent, and you're listening to the Hustle Daily Show's Weekend Edition. Today, we're going to talk about the supply chain, and I would wager that until 3, maybe 4 years ago, you had probably never thought about it. But then sometime in 2021, I'm guessing you ordered something online and then waited and waited and waited for it to show up. What happened was that as COVID wreaked havoc around the world, the supply chain got twisted and pulled and almost completely snapped. And there was basically a shortage of factory workers in China, a shortage of shipping containers, a shortage of ships to take those containers to the United States, a shortage of room on those ships, and a shortage of room for those ships to dock at a port in the United States, along with a shortage of truckers to take whatever those goods were across the country. You might be wondering why we were ever in this unnecessarily complex situation and if there's any way out of it. Well, Peter Goodman has explored these questions in great depth in his new book, How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain. Peter is the global economics correspondent for the New York Times, and he's here to talk with us today. Peter, thanks so much for joining us on the Hustle Daily Show.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark.
Yeah. All right. So, Peter, I wanted to start off with this. You've been the global economics correspondent at the New York Times for a bit, but I'm wondering, like, before COVID, how much had you really thought about the supply chain, and why do you think it's something that a lot of us just overlook?
I had thought about it a fair bit. I mean, it's sort of insinuated into every economic story, but I did think of it as this wonky thing. I never expected to write a book about it because, the supply chain is basically built inviting us to not think about the army of people who manufacture our stuff in factories, who then carry that product around the world and eventually to our door. It's one of those few things that we actually all kind of agree on some level that, we may think it's savory or unsavory or whatever, but we have faith that go on Amazon, click a button, wait maybe just a few hours, maybe a couple of days, and eventually the thing shows up. Well, when it buckled, that was kind of cosmically disorienting for a lot of people. I mean, we're in the middle of the pandemic. We're already dealing with, if you have children, kids cooped up by distance learning. We're worried about older relatives. We're unclear about our own job security. Even those of us who are lucky enough to be able to work from home, we don't know how we're going to get groceries. And to have the supply chain, this thing that, to your point, we don't actually think about most of the time, buckle. It was as if, all the lights don't work and we can't get a dial tone anymore. It was really bewildering.
Right. And it wasn't always this way. If we go back, a few decades and certainly even further back than that, there was a time when not everything came from China or from, some other country. You bring up in your book the example of Henry Ford, who, when he started his Ford Motor Company, he used to get local supplies. And then, he changed that a little bit, which then kind of led to some even further changes down the road. What kind of happened, way back then that started to bring us toward this situation where we have this really complex global supply chain?
Well, Ford was bringing in supplies from far away, but he was really insistent that he not be in a position where his own production could be threatened by something that a supplier did. So, he bought his own railroads. He bought shipping companies to use the Great Lakes to bring commodities to his giant factory on the River Rouge. What happened really, to compress the story, is some was technology. So in the 1950s, we get the advent of the shipping container. That's a really big deal. Previously loading and unloading a ship could take days. It was really dangerous. There was no template. It was like a jigsaw puzzle, really. Like I got to figure out how to get this big drum of chemicals over here. Where's the big side of beef going? Every job was like a custom job. And along comes the shipping container, so you can load and unload things into the container at factories. You can use standardized equipment, these cranes that can lift the container, put it on the back of a truck, a rail car, and a ship. And that speeded up transportation. It made transportation a lot cheaper because it squeezed dock workers out of the equation. So that encouraged companies to look further and further afield for supplies. And so a lot of production starts to move overseas. But then we also get, and this can't be overstressed really, financialization. The logic of the shareholders' interest being paramount. You get publicly traded companies that are most concerned about the next quarterly earnings. They're under great pressure to cut costs. And that finally combined with integration, these international trade agreements that open up Mexico, Central America, eventually bring China into the World Trade Organization. You put all these things together, and there's just a great demand for corporate executives to go move production further and further away.
Yeah, and why is that? The way that we kind of think of corporate executives and these publicly traded companies, obviously they are answering to their shareholders and considering that paramount above anything else. But why is it that shareholders think that it's more valuable for a company to have these far-flung supply chain methods that certainly do make it cheaper rather than having longer-term investment or sustainability and protection against harms? Like, why is that first option favored more?
It's short-term thinking, right? I mean, we have such turnover in the executive ranks. We have investors dipping in and out of stocks. And so the stock becomes the product for lots of companies. And so anything that will tend to make share prices go up is embraced. And this goes in hand with just in time, this concept that you should go as lean as possible on the inventory because Wall Street is paying for this one metric in particular, return on assets. That's the revenue you're bringing in divided by the assets on your balance sheet. Inventories is an asset. So by lowering your inventory, not putting lots of parts and raw materials as a hedge against trouble in warehouses, you're increasing your return on asset. But, as one business professor put it to me, if you can't make a ventilator in the middle of a pandemic, you don't get to say to society, well, at least our share price is high. But that's essentially how we've optimized the supply chain to make share prices go up above all.
Right. And just in time, as you write in the book, it started out as a pretty reasonable idea because it doesn't make a lot of sense for companies to, waste a bunch of supplies that may never actually go into products they're using or having a lot of leftover products that they'll never sell. But what kind of changed that led companies to perhaps maybe take just in time a little too far?
Yeah, just in time was a great idea. It was pioneered by Toyota at the end of the Second World War. It was a pushback to the kind of mass assembly that Ford had delivered in the US. I mean, Toyota was actually very admiring of Ford, but they said this is not going to work in Japan. It's the end of the Second World War. Capital is very limited. They're dealing with the devastation of the war. They don't have that much developable land in Japan, so they can't just, build factories willy-nilly. They had to be very selective. And Toyota comes up with this concept of let's just make as many cars as we need to replenish those that are sold. And let's have our suppliers deliver the parts we need at our assembly lines just as we need them. So we don't have to stash all these parts in warehouses. And this works out great for Toyota. It becomes a mantra, just in time and then lean manufacturing around the world as companies use it to strip waste out of their own production. But then along comes, again, the logic of financialization and specifically the consulting class. I spent a lot of time in the book telling the story of McKinsey and how McKinsey turns this idea into this very crude imperative to just limit inventory and take the savings that companies derive from no longer stashing inventory in warehouses, give it to executives through executive compensation, give it to shareholders in the form of dividends, make share prices go up. But anytime there's a shock to the system, we're stretched so thin. There's no margin for trouble. And so the pandemic was far from the first time we saw the consequences, but it was really profound. It was more of like a reveal than a source of the trouble. It was a reveal of vulnerabilities that had been there for years.
Were there some shocks because of just in time before the pandemic? Maybe individual companies or the economy at large?
The first supply chain story I ever wrote was back in 1999. There was an earthquake in Taiwan. I was covering telecom at the Washington Post. And people back then said, that's a lot of computer chips we're making in Taiwan. We're probably going to have some shortages of computer chips and electronics. Maybe we should think about diversifying the supply a bit. The real landmark was 2012 and the Fukushima nuclear disaster. For months afterwards, we had all sorts of electronics in short supply. And people again said, we're over concentrating production in these key places. There was a book that I draw on in my own book, came out, I think, in 2014, that predicted that a pandemic would be the thing that would bring the supply chains down with all sorts of financial consequences. But, basically the incentives on Wall Street were such that it just didn't make any sense for people running companies to pay that much attention. I mean, lean manufacturing was good for share prices. And if you were a forward-looking CEO who said, I don't know, it seems like we need more resilience, that amounted to demanding that you dilute earnings. If you said, well, we're not just going to make all our chips in Taiwan, or we're not going to entrust all of our factory production for medical gowns and face masks in China, we're going to move that production somewhere else, that redundancy would cost money. And other places, of course, couldn't produce as cheaply as China. And so corporate executives had every reason to just pretend that every shock was just a one-off, and let's get back to this lucrative process of doing it how we've always been doing it.
And what happened to America's factories and the output that America once had? I mean, as we know, manufacturing jobs have declined significantly, basically from 1950 onward until maybe just a few years ago. Could a company even get its product manufactured in the U.S. if it wanted to avoid some of these potential pitfalls?
My book, which is really written for ordinary readers, traces the passage of one shipping container from a factory town in China, Ningbo, to Starkville, Mississippi, which is the home base of this startup company called Glow. And I sit alongside Hagen Walker, who's the founder, as he tries to get the most important shipment in the history of his business across the Pacific and then across the continent. And Hagen was really interesting to talk to because he really wanted to make his stuff in the United States.
Yeah.
And he looked around. He makes these novelty cubes that light up when you drop them in water. His earliest customers were bartenders who liked, sticking these cubes in their cocktails. And then you could look down the bar and see who needed a refill because the light would go off. And he started looking around for companies in the States, and he discovered that just to make the plates required to mold the plastic, that would be 12 times more expensive in the US than in China. Eventually he gets a deal with Sesame Street to make these Elmo-themed bath toys. That's the shipment that I follow in the book. And he wanted a kind of children's pop-up book style packaging. He looked around, and one company was doing that work by farming it out to China. And the other said, this is just too complicated. You just have to go to China. I mean, once everybody else goes, then the raw materials go, the components go. It's very difficult. You're really swimming upstream by the time Hagen Walker's placing this order in 2021 to look for ways to make stuff not in China.
So someone like Hagen Walker ideally would like to get his products made in America.
For sure.
But he doesn't really have a choice, though. It's like you were saying, it's
That's
the
right.
kind of the Wall Street money managers who have kind of demanded this type of supply chain, and the executives at the large companies kind of drove it. And now small business people like Hagen Walker are kind of at their whims to an extent.
Yeah, I mean, it's the path of least resistance. And, I think it's worth pausing to note that, one of the few things we seem to agree on in politics in the United States is that China's eating our lunch. China's this juggernaut. China's not playing fair. There's validity to the idea that China has gamed the rules of the trading system. I mean, there's a lot of theft of intellectual property. There's a lot of subsidies. The World Trade Organization rules don't do a very good job of policing those. But really, this production moved because American retailers demanded it. They lobbied the Clinton administration heavily, and the Clinton administration spun this whole fairy tale that it wasn't about cutting costs. It wasn't about selling products to Chinese consumers. It was about democratizing China. I was based in China right after this went down. That always seemed kind of ridiculous. But what happened was giant retailers like Walmart essentially engaged in a joint venture with the People's Republic of China to go to a place where labor unions were banned, environmental and workplace standards, you could get around them by cutting in the local Chinese Communist Party official. And it was an unbeatable combination of factors that allowed you to get your goods made very cheaply and get them onto ships and send them back to your market. And until there were shocks, it worked well, not only for retailers and their investors, but also for consumers because we got very cheap products, but we were always vulnerable to these shocks.
Yeah. And so how long exactly would it take an average shipping container to get from China to the port of Los Angeles or Long Beach to maybe somewhere across the country, say, pre-pandemic versus during the pandemic at the worst stage? What was the kind of difference?
6 to 8 weeks was typical, sometimes as little as 4 weeks, but usually like 6 to 8 weeks if you were going somewhere inland in the States. And then during the worst of it, you had, take LA Long Beach, and you're right to note that that's the key center of the action. That's the gateway for 40% of all goods imported to the US by container ship. And at the worst of it in the fall of 2021, you've got 50, 60, sometimes 70 ships just floating, waiting for their chance to load and unload at the docks because the whole system is overwhelmed. So sometimes 3 or 4 weeks is going by. This is after the ships have crossed the Pacific, before they can load and unload. Then there's delays to get the containers out of the ports because, as you correctly note in the introduction, we're running short of warehouse workers. There aren't enough truck drivers who are doing this work. So it could take, for some companies, months and months, 5 months, 6 months. In Hagen Walker's case, he places this order in late 2020. Looking ahead, almost a year before the holiday season. And it takes 10 months to get his box across the Pacific into his warehouse in Mississippi, sweating it out the whole way.
So for Hagen Walker, it was an okay ending for him. It kind of worked out, but it took so much just planning on his part and the different kind of scenes that you have with him in this book where, you have him like trying to call these people in China and these different factories and there's different brokers and it just seems like there is so much complication. And again, I wonder, in his case, it would have been nearly impossible to get his products made in the US. But even during good times, are some of these complications of even just having to have all these communications with China, can that be difficult for small businesses?
Yeah, the complexity is difficult for sure, though a lot of suppliers in China have done it really remarkable job of interfacing with Americans. There are apps, In fact, Hagen Walker, to your point, tried to move his production out of China. He was thinking about moving to Vietnam. He thought about Cambodia. And in the end, he decided to stay in China. And this is even with, Trump comes into office and slaps tariffs on Chinese imports across the board. Biden continues those tariffs. Whatever happens in our presidential election in November, everybody assumes that the U.S.-China trade animosity is a near permanent feature of policy. So that combined with shipping problems, Hagen Walker decides maybe it's a good idea to not have all of our production in China. But the end of the book is, it's very difficult to break up with China. He shows me this app, this Alibaba screen. This is the giant Chinese e-commerce company, and there's a lot of business to business stuff. And he says, look, if I need, some component, some electronic, and I put out a request for bids, within 15 minutes, I'll get 20 proposals from around China. I'll get pictures of factories, reviews like on an Amazon page from previous companies that had dealt with these suppliers. And I can reach these people in real time. I can chat with them on WeChat. I can text with them various ways. If I tried to do that in Vietnam, it would take me a couple of years just to build up such a roster of suppliers. So if you're big enough, if you're Walmart, your Target, your Amazon, it makes sense to do that work. If you're a small company like Glow, he's moving, 1 or 2 containers across the ocean in the course of a year, then there's just a gravitational force that keeps you in China.
Given those advantages, and it's now been 2 years since kind of the worst of the pandemic supply chain problems, has anybody broken up with China? Has anyone come a little bit closer to finally seeing the way that the supply chain got stretched and wanted to do something about it?
Yeah. There is a process of diversification, de-risking. These are the terms you hear thrown about. I just came back from a couple of weeks in India where Walmart is moving some of their production from China. They got this target to increase their sourcing from India from about $3 billion a year now to something like $10 billion by 2027. I'll put it to you this way. Like 15 years ago, if you flew into Walmart's headquarters in Bentonville, Arkansas, you have to go to them. They don't come to you. It's like going to visit the Pope. You're trying to get your product on the shelf of a Walmart superstore, and you would go in and you would see your buyer's representative at Walmart, and they would say, where are you making your product? And if the answer was something other than China, you had some explanation required, because that just identified you as not getting the lowest possible price. You couldn't possibly be making it at the greatest scale. Now, if you fly to Bentonville and have that same conversation and they ask you, where are you making your product? And the answer is only China, you have a problem. They want to know, what's your backup plan? Are you thinking about Mexico to get closer to the US market so you don't have to worry about shipping across the Pacific? I followed Columbia Sportswear to Guatemala to look at sites there because they want to move production closer to their largest market in North America. I spent a lot of time in Mexico for the book and ran into all sorts of suppliers that most people have never heard of. These are like, a Chinese wheel company that makes aluminum wheels for Ford and GM. They're setting up a factory in Nuevo León, Mexico. That's a border state. And I said, well, why are you guys here? And they said, because Ford and GM let us know that if we're not within several hours by rail or road of their factories, they're going to find some other supplier. We'll lose their business. So some of this is happening. The question is, will this stick as our memories of the pandemic begin to recede?
Even with that diversification and having your products made in Vietnam in addition to China or Mexico or Guatemala, as you suggested, is that close enough, though, if there's another global pandemic? Because, that affected literally every country. And so I wonder, at what point will it ever make sense to have more production in the U.S., at least from an economic standpoint for some of these big companies? Obviously, we've seen the investment in chips in Arizona, and, there's some high-profile examples like that.
Right.
But generally speaking, is any of this going to translate to more production in the U.S., and should it?
It will translate to more production in the U.S. for things that rise to the level of, national security, like chips, or this push from the Biden administration to bring more electric vehicle production to the states. And there's a lot of money being spent. We're talking direct subsidies reaching tens of billions of dollars. In terms of things like, clothing, it's sort of like labor-intensive products where you either have to automate or you're paying people, minimal wages. It's unlikely that a lot of this stuff will come back at real scale to the U.S. I tell the story of this guy, Taylor Shoup, who spent a lot of his life in China making things for the American market. He's one of the founders of Stance, the sock brand that, Jay-Z's got a song about them. LeBron and other NBA stars have worn them. He's a very fashion conscious guy. He's attuned to the tastes of consumers. And Taylor Shoup, again, who spent a lot of his lifetime in China, has concluded that made in China has become a branding liability. A lot of stories of, forced labor going into producing cotton in Xinjiang by the ethnic minority Uyghur people. In fact, the American government accused the Chinese government of genocide. There are strong penalties if you're caught bringing goods in that use forced labor. So there are a lot of reasons why, from a branding standpoint, made in the US versus made in China has really gained traction. But some of this stuff is overblown. There's an outfit called the Reshoring Institute run by a guy named Harry Holzer. And I called him up, and he was full of, all kinds of incredible statistics about production coming back to the U.S. And I asked him for some case studies. And one of them was this electric bike manufacturer. Mm-hmm. And I called the CEO. This is a guy in Texas. And he said, oh, no, we're just bringing in, goods that are made in Asia to Texas and then assembling them. If we tried to make all this stuff in the U.S., the bike would cost $6,000, and we're selling it for $2,000. Nobody's going to pay $6,000 for an electric bike. So you got to think globalization's with us. It's changing. There's a greater push to get production closer to home. There are areas. If you're thinking about the ability to make vaccines, basic medicines, ventilators, to make sure that our medical workers can be outfitted with protective gear in a pandemic, where there's definitely an argument for stockpiling, for building up greater capacity. And there is a sort of reassertion of place instead of just pretending that, It doesn't matter if the factory's down the street or across the ocean. That's definitely changing, but we're still going to be drawing on factories outside the United States for all sorts of goods. Because if we tried to shift this quickly, we would dramatically increase the cost of production and we'd throw a lot of people out of work. It's worth remembering that lots of factory jobs in the U.S. are dependent upon bringing in components and raw materials from overseas.
So it seems like, in other words, that the way that some of this production might shift to the US is really going to be for like these vital products in which it doesn't necessarily matter what the cost is to some degree. Like it's okay with paying more because it's so important. But for a lot of discretionary goods like clothing, people are still obviously buying from Shein, to say the least.
Right.
That stuff is probably not going to come back because no one is going to pay for the expensive cost that it would entail.
I mean, unless you want to start paying $30 for a pair of tube socks, I don't think we're going to be making them in the Carolinas anytime soon. The question is, will we make them closer to the U.S.?
Yeah.
And will we give a thought to labor standards that go into making them? But there are definitely things that we didn't think about that are strategically significant that we're now thinking about.
One thing that you kind of bring up constantly in this book, it's a theme that I think for good reason has been part of a lot of financial books lately, including ones that have been specifically about McKinsey. It goes to like this sort of like ethos of the shareholder and that everything is done. I mean, almost every chapter you kind of come back to, well, this happened so the shareholders could get rich, and especially the executives who could then, get a spot on the private plane. And if they did something to protect the company's long-term interest, that literally might be enough to boot them off of the private plane.
Right.
Is there any way that we can change that mindset to lead to a more efficient supply chain and to, frankly, better paying jobs for people who are part of it?
Yeah, I mean, you're right to put your focus there. We need to get out of this short-term, quarter-by-quarter mentality. Some of this requires regulation. I tell the story in the book of how the duopoly companies that control our rail systems have created a situation where they're catering to shareholders so directly. They want to drop dwell time. That's the amount of time that cargo sits in any one place, such that I talked to this engineer who's in Idaho who was horrified to discover that he's actually pulling cargo in the wrong direction because somebody at a rail yard in Nebraska, this is Union Pacific, gets the corporate mantra to lower dwell time and concludes, next train out of here, I'm attaching as many cars to it as possible. I don't care where they're supposed to go. They're going on the next train because I'll succeed in lowering dwell time. I mean, some of that can be handled again at the regulatory level. I mean, there should be penalties if you end up making shippers wait. Some of this is investors realizing that they're the ones getting ripped off in this scenario. I mean, if your interest is in purely the next quarter, then maybe you're happy with this bit of chicanery. But if you're thinking about the operational health of companies, that's not a good way to do business. Some of this, I don't put a lot of stock on consumers fixing in the supply chain. We're busy with our jobs, our kids, sleep, health. We don't have a lot of time to just be full-time supply chain geeks. But to the extent to which we can think as consumers about buying from smaller producers who are local, there's some complexity in terms of the climate considerations. Sometimes larger scale operations are actually more efficient from a standpoint of lowering emissions. So it's difficult to totally generalize, but supporting your local producer is generally a good thing to do. And you can have your eyes on who's making your products and how.
One final question. You've been kind of reporting this story right now, but there's something happening that's actually causing a little bit of a snafu for the global supply chain right now.
Right.
What's going on?
Yeah, we've got shipping prices, again, soaring. Hagen Walker was dealing with the fact that moving a shipping container from Shanghai to the West Coast of the U.S. had gone from below $2,000 to, he ended up paying $28,000 in the space of a few months. Well, we're not quite that high, but we've seen a roughly 5-fold increase in shipping prices globally. And that's in large part because the Houthis, in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza, have been opening fire on ships entering the Red Sea en route to the Suez Canal. That's like a key artery for sea traffic that's moving from Asia to Europe and to the East Coast of the US. And so that's forced ships to go the long way around Africa. That involves burning more fuel. But, there's a lot of suspicion that shipping carriers, who are basically this unregulated international cartel, 3 alliances, think like airline alliances, dominate basically 95% of the traffic on the busiest routes. So we have no way of knowing, how much of these extra costs are recouping their own real costs versus profiteering. But there's a lot of unhappiness and there's a lot of worry that the holiday season could again bring shortages. You've got lots of retailers ordering extra stuff now because they're worried about delays in shipping, and that could create the traffic jams all by itself. My book is not a history book. There's a lot of history in it.
Right.
It's about the present. It's really about the future if we don't figure this out.
Yeah, and the supply chain, while it kind of sounds boring on the surface, it definitely isn't. Not in 2021 and not now. Thank you again, Peter, for joining us. His book is How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain.
Hey, thanks so much, Mark. That was great.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's going to do it for us today. We're a proud part of the HubSpot Podcast Network. Our editor today is Robert Hartwig, and our executive producer is Darren Clark. We got a lot more tech and business coverage in our newsletter, so if you're not subscribed, please go get yourself signed up at thehustle.co/email, and we'll see you tomorrow.